In 1833, a ship called the Tuscany arrived in Calcutta, India, after 4 months at sea. The cargo hold was packed with something that shouldn't have existed there. Not spices, not cotton, not weapons, ice. 180 tons of frozen water, cut from a pond in Massachusetts, wrapped in sawdust, and shipped 10,000 miles across 2 oceans to a country where temperatures regularly hit 110 degrees. When dock workers in Calcutta cracked open those holds, they found that 2/3 of the ice had survived. It was still frozen, still solid. And within hours, British colonials were drinking cold beer for the first time in their lives. This wasn't magic. This was the American ice trade. And before refrigerators existed, before electricity hummed through power lines, before Freon and compressors and the gentle hum of your kitchen freezer, there was an industry that did something genuinely insane. It harvested winter. It carved frozen lakes into blocks the size of hay bales. It shipped those blocks to places that had never seen snow. And it changed how the entire world ate, drank, and preserved the dead. At its peak, America was cutting 10 million tons of ice every single year. Not from factories, from nature, from lakes and rivers and ponds across New England, by hand, with saws and horses, and the raw muscle of men who woke before dawn in temperatures that killed. This is the story of how we did it, how we built an empire from frozen water, and what it cost the men who stood on those lakes. Before we can understand the ice trade, you need to understand what life was like without ice. And I don't mean without your refrigerator. I mean without any reliable way to keep anything cold. In 1800, if you lived in Boston or New York or Philadelphia, summer meant one thing for food: rot. Meat spoiled within hours of slaughter, milk soured by noon, fish could only be eaten the day it was caught, and even then, you were gambling. Vegetables wilted, butter melted into yellow pools. The smell of decay was simply part of urban life from May through September. Wealthy families had ice houses, underground pits, dug deep into the earth and lined with straw, where they could store ice cut from local ponds during winter. But these were status symbols reserved for the rich. The ice rarely lasted past June. A family that could serve cold drinks in July was announcing their wealth as clearly as if they'd hung their bank statements on the wall. And the poor ate whatever hadn't turned yet and prayed they wouldn't get sick. Cholera outbreaks killed thousands every summer. Dysentery was so common it had nicknames: the summer complaint, the bloody flux. Children died from spoiled milk at rates that would horrify any modern parent. In the summer of 1832, a cholera epidemic killed 3,500 people in New York City alone. And there was simply nothing to be done about it. Heat was heat. Rot was rot. That was the natural order. Now imagine you're a doctor in 1800. A patient comes in with a raging fever. Their skin is on fire. They're delirious. And your only tools are bleeding, blistering, and prayer. There's no way to bring down that fever. No cold compresses that stay cold. No ice baths. You watch patients cook from the inside and call it God's will. Yellow fever, malaria, typhoid. These diseases burn through bodies, and doctors stood helpless because they couldn't do the one thing that might help. Cool them down, or imagine you're a fisherman in Gloucester. You haul in a catch that could feed 100 families. But you're 3 days from market. By the time you dock, half your catch is garbage. You throw it back in the ocean and sell what's left at a loss. The same story played out in every fishing village on the Atlantic coast. The ocean was full of food, but it spoiled faster than it could travel. Or imagine you're a rancher in Texas. You've got cattle, thousands of cattle, and the nearest city that could eat them is 1,000 miles away. You can drive them there, losing weight and value with every mile. Or you can slaughter them locally and watch the meat rot before you can sell it. There was no choice. The geography of food was fixed by biology's clock. This was the world before ice, not primitive in every way, but fundamentally limited by decay. The second law of thermodynamics playing out on every kitchen table, in every sick room, in every fishing boat holed across America. And then came Frederick Tudor. Frederick Tudor was born in 1783 to a wealthy Boston family, which meant he had two things most people didn't: money to lose and time to think. His father was a successful lawyer. His brothers went into respectable professions. Frederick was the dreamer, the one the family worried about. In 1805, at a family picnic, his brother William made a joke. They were eating ice cream. The kind of luxury that only existed in winter because there was no way to make it in summer. And William said something like, there are people in the Caribbean who have never tasted anything cold in their entire lives. Most people would have laughed and moved on. Frederick Tudor did not move on. He became obsessed. What if you could ship ice to the Caribbean? What if you could take something that was free, literally free, that just fell from the sky every winter and sell it to people who had never seen it? His family thought he was insane. His friends mocked him openly. The Boston Gazette called his plan a slippery speculation. Ship ice to the tropics? It would melt before it left the harbor. Everyone knew that. But Tudor saw something no one else did. He saw that ice wasn't just frozen water, it was preserved time. It was winter stored in solid form. And if you could figure out how to keep it frozen long enough, you could sell winter to people living in endless summer. You could sell the impossible. In February 1806, Tudor filled a brig with ice cut from his family's pond in Saugus, Massachusetts, and sailed for Martinique. He was 23 years old. He had no buyers lined up, no infrastructure waiting, no guarantee that a single block would survive the 3-week voyage. He had borrowed money from everyone who would lend it. His cargo was melting from the moment he loaded it. And here is where the story gets interesting. The ice survived. Not all of it, but enough. Tudor arrived in Martinique with actual frozen water, and he discovered a problem he hadn't anticipated. Nobody knew what to do with it. The locals had never seen ice. They didn't have ice houses. They didn't have ice boxes. They touched it and jumped back, thinking it would burn them. They literally did not understand what they were looking at. Tudor had planned for the melting. He hadn't planned for this. He tried to sell to bars, but the bartenders didn't know how to chip ice properly. He tried to sell to hospitals, but the doctors were skeptical of this strange American remedy. He tried to give demonstrations, showing how ice could keep food fresh, but people were more fascinated than convinced. Tudor sold almost nothing. He lost nearly $4,000, which was a fortune in 1806. He went home humiliated. But he didn't stop. This is what separates Frederick Tudor from the people who mocked him. He failed, and he failed again. And he kept failing for almost 15 years. He went bankrupt, and twice. He went to debtor's prison, where he sat in a cell and planned his next attempt. He borrowed money from everyone who would lend it, and some who wouldn't. His own family cut him off financially. His fiancée's father ended their engagement, not wanting his daughter married to a lunatic who was obsessed with frozen water. And every single winter, Tudor went back out on those frozen ponds and cut more ice. What Tudor understood, what took him years of failure to prove, was that selling ice wasn't a product problem. It was an infrastructure problem. You couldn't just show up with ice. You had to teach people how to use it. You had to build ice houses in tropical ports. You had to train bartenders to chip it properly. You had to convince doctors that ice could reduce fevers. You had to create the demand you wanted to supply. He started experimenting with insulation. Straw, hay, wood shavings. He discovered that sawdust worked best, trapping air in tiny pockets that slowed heat transfer to almost nothing. A block of ice buried in sawdust could survive for months. He designed ice houses with double walls and minimum windows, structures that worked like primitive refrigerators. He went back to the Caribbean. Not just once, again and again, he built ice houses in Havana with his own money. He gave free ice to bartenders to get them hooked on cold drinks. He sent ice to hospitals for free and published testimonials from doctors who used it to break fevers. He was creating a market from scratch, teaching an entire population to need something they had lived without for centuries. By 1820, Tudor had ice houses in Havana, Charleston, Savannah, and New Orleans. He had contracts with hospitals and hotels. He had trained an entire generation of Southern bartenders to serve cold drinks. The mint julep That quintessential Southern cocktail exists because Frederick Tudor figured out how to get ice to Kentucky. And then he looked east, to India, to a country of 300 million people living under British colonial rule, sweating through summers that made Georgia look mild, with absolutely no access to cold anything. The logistics were insane. India was 16,000 miles from Boston by sea. The voyage took 4 to 6 months. The ship would cross the equator twice, spending weeks in tropical heat. Nobody had ever tried to keep ice frozen for that long. Nobody believed it could be done. Tudor believed it could be done. In May 1833, his ship Tuscany departed Boston Harbor loaded with 180 tons of ice, packed tight in sawdust, bound for Calcutta. 4 months later, it arrived. The ship had crossed the equator, weathered storms, sat becalmed in tropical doldrums where the air didn't move and the temperature in the hold climbed past 90. When dock workers opened the holds, they found that almost 2/3 of the ice had survived. The British colonials lost their minds. They had been in India for decades, suffering through heat that drove men mad, watching their butter liquefy and their meat turn green within hours of cooking. They had dreamed of cold things. They had written letters home describing the torture of endless heat. And now they were holding actual ice in their hands. Tudor charged premium prices. The British paid gladly. A man who had been sweating through Indian summers for 20 years would pay almost anything for a cold drink. The Calcutta Ice House, built specifically to store Tudor's shipments, became one of the most important buildings in the city. Within a decade, Tudor was shipping ice to India, to China, to the Philippines, to Australia, to anywhere that had a port and a population tired of being hot. He became known as the Ice King. His fortune grew to what would be hundreds of millions in today's money, and he had started it all with a joke at a family picnic. But here is what the story of Frederick Tudor usually leaves out. He didn't cut that ice himself. He didn't load those ships. He didn't stand on frozen lakes in January, working a saw through 18 inches of solid water while the wind cut through his clothes like they weren't there. That was someone else's job, and that job was something close to hell. Let me take you to a frozen lake in January. The year is 1870. The location is Wenham Lake in Massachusetts, though it could be any of 100 lakes across New England, or the Kennebec River in Maine, or Rockland Lake in New York, or any of the frozen waterways that fed the ice trade's endless hunger. The ice trade has grown from Tudor's one-man obsession into a massive industry. Hundreds of companies, tens of thousands of workers, millions of tons harvested every winter. And you're about to start your shift. You arrive before dawn because that's when the foreman calls time. The temperature is 8 degrees below zero. You can feel your nostril hairs freeze with every breath. The wind comes off the lake at 20 miles per hour, and it finds every gap in your clothing, every exposed inch of skin. Your eyes water, and the tears freeze on your cheeks. The lake stretches out in front of you, a flat white plain in the darkness, and somewhere out there, lanterns are already moving. Men are already working. The first thing you notice is the sound, not silence. Never silence on a working ice lake. The ice is groaning, cracking, settling. It sounds like a living thing, and in a way it is. Water expands when it freezes, and all winter long, the ice is moving, shifting, building pressure that releases in cracks that can run for hundreds of yards in seconds. Old hands tell you to listen carefully. A certain kind of crack means the ice is safe, just settling under its own weight. Another kind of crack means get off the lake, now, because something is about to give. Your crew has already been here for hours. The lake has been scraped clean of snow, which acts as an insulator and ruins the clarity of the ice. Now the surface gleams like black glass in the lamplight. Black ice, they call it. The good stuff. Clear enough to read a newspaper through. Hotels in New York paid premium prices for Wenham Lake ice because it was so clear, so pure-looking, that wealthy customers would put it in their drinks and admire it before it melted. The cutting grid has been marked out. Iron bars laid down in a checkerboard pattern, 22 inches apart, because that's the standard size. A block of ice, 22 inches square, sawed to the depth of the ice, which here is about 18 inches. Each block weighs close to 300 pounds. You're working a groove plow first. It's pulled by a team of 2 horses, fitted with iron teeth that bite into the ice and cut grooves about 4 inches deep. Your job is to walk behind the plow and make sure the grooves cut straight. The horses know the work better than you do. They've done it for years. They can walk the grid pattern without guidance, turning at the end of each row as if they'd measured it themselves. But horses fall through ice every year. You've heard the stories. A horse breaking through, screaming as the cold water hits, thrashing until the traces pull the other horse toward the hole. Men have died trying to save horses. Men have died being pulled in after them. The company puts metal shoes with sharp calks on the horses to help them grip. But ice is ice. Sometimes it breaks. Once the grooves are cut, the saws come out. Long, heavy, 2-man crosscut saws with teeth designed to bite through ice. You take one end, another man takes the other, and you work that saw back and forth, deepening the groove until you hit water. The rhythm becomes hypnotic. The saw makes a singing sound as it cuts, and the ice dust sprays up like snow. Your arms burn after the first hour. By the 3rd hour, you've stopped feeling them. By the 6th hour, you're working on pure will. Your body moving automatically while your mind goes somewhere else, anywhere that isn't this frozen lake in the dark. The ice separates into blocks along the scored lines, and now comes the part that separates new men from experienced ones. The blocks have to come up and out, 300 pounds each. You're using ice hooks on long poles with sharp metal points that bite into the ice, and pike poles to push the blocks toward the channel that's been cut to the shore. The water in that channel is 20 feet deep and 32 degrees. Fall in, and you have about 3 minutes before the cold shuts down your muscles, maybe 5 minutes before you lose consciousness. The channel is kept open by men with long poles who push away the ice that tries to form, and their job is one of the most dangerous on the lake. They work at the edge of open water all day long, one slip from drowning. You've seen men go in. 1 minute they're working the blocks, the next minute they've stepped wrong, and they're gone to the waist, clawing at ice that breaks under their hands. If they're lucky, someone gets a rope around them fast enough and hauls them out. Then it's a race to get them to a warming house before the hypothermia takes hold. If they're not lucky, you fish their body out in the spring when the ice melts. Sometimes you don't find them at all. The current carries them away, and they become another name the foreman scratches out of his book. The cold is constant, and it is cruel. Your fingers stop feeling after the first hour. Your feet stopped feeling before you got to the lake. You're wearing everything you own, layers of wool and cotton that get damp with sweat despite the cold, and then freeze against your skin. Frostbite takes men's toes, their fingers, their ears, their noses. You learn to watch for the white patches on other men's faces because they can't feel it happening to themselves. A tap on the shoulder, a point at the cheek, and the man rubs snow on it trying to bring the blood back. Some men lose toes every winter. Some men lose fingers. Some men lose enough that they can't work anymore. And then they're done, because there's no compensation for injury, no pension, no safety net. Just a man with fewer fingers trying to find work that doesn't need hands. And you do this for 10, 12, 14 hours a day. Every day of January and February. Every day until the ice gets too thin to work, or the quota's met, or your body simply gives out. You're paid by the block or by the day, depending on your crew, and either way it's not enough. But it's work. In winter, when the farms are frozen solid and the factories are slow and there's nothing else, ice harvesting is work. The wages were about $1.50 to $2 a day. For context, a skilled factory worker made maybe $2.50. So ice harvesting paid decent for unskilled labor, but the season was short, 6 weeks, maybe 8 if the winter was cold enough. A man could make $50 or $60 in a season, enough to get his family through to spring if he was careful. Not enough to get ahead, just enough to survive. The men who did this work were not celebrated. They were not remembered. They were farm hands looking for winter work, and fishermen whose boats were frozen in, and immigrants fresh off the boat. Irishmen fleeing the famine, Scandinavians who at least knew cold, Germans with nothing but their backs to sell. The industry called them ice harvesters. The newspapers, when they mentioned them at all, called them laborers. History barely calls them anything, and many of them lived in boarding houses near the lakes, packed 10 or 12 to a room, paying most of their wages back to the company for lodging and food. The company store sold them supplies at marked up prices. Some weeks, a man would work 60 hours and break even after room and board. It was a system designed to extract labor while giving back as little as possible. The ice trade's profits went to men like Tudor. The ice trade's costs went to men whose names we never learned. But they built an empire. Block by 300-pound block, they cut 10 million tons of winter out of American lakes and rivers every year at the industry's peak. They filled ice houses that stretched for acres along the Hudson. They loaded ships that sailed to India and China and Brazil. They kept your great-great-grandmother's milk from spoiling and brought down your great-great-grandfather's fever and made it possible for a butcher in New Orleans to sell beef that was slaughtered in Chicago. And some of them died doing it. The ice trade kept records of production, not casualties. We don't have exact numbers. The companies didn't want exact numbers. A death on the ice was a problem to be managed, not a tragedy to be mourned. But the newspaper accounts from the era tell the story in fragments. January 14th, 1871, Kennebec River, Maine. 3 men drowned when ice broke during harvesting operations. Bodies not recovered. February 8th, 1879, Rockland Lake, New York. Ice house collapse killed 2 workers and injured 6. Cause attributed to overloading. January 22nd, 1883, Hudson River. Worker crushed between ice blocks during loading. Died of injuries. February 12th, 1886, Fresh Pond, Cambridge. Teamster fell through ice. Horse and cart lost. Man survived with severe frostbite, both feet later amputated. These aren't statistics. These are people. Men who went to work one morning and never came home. Men who came home but came back less than they left. The newspapers printed these stories for a day, maybe 2, and then moved on. The ice harvest continued. There was money to be made. The danger wasn't one thing. It was everything. The ice itself could break without warning, especially late in the season when the cutting had weakened it. A man could be working solid ice one minute and standing on a sheet that cracked and tilted the next. The channels where blocks were floated could freeze over on cold nights, trapping men on ice floes that drifted toward open water. Workers would have to jump from floe to get back to shore, one wrong step from the water. Ice houses were 40 feet tall, crammed with blocks stacked tight, and they collapsed more often than anyone wanted to admit. A load shift, a structural weakness, a beam that gave way, and tons of ice came down on whoever was inside. The men who worked in ice houses stacking blocks worked fast, because the faster you worked, the less time you spent under a potential avalanche. And there was the cold itself, slow, patient, relentless. A man could work a full shift and not realize his feet had frozen until he tried to take off his boots that night and found they wouldn't come off because they were frozen to his skin. Gangrene followed, then amputation. Then, often, a death from infection in the days before antibiotics. The hospitals in ice country filled up every February. The men knew the risks. They worked anyway, because the alternative was no work at all, and a family that didn't eat, and a landlord who didn't care why the rent was late. The ice trade took these men's lives and their health and their digits, and it gave them just enough money to survive until next winter, when they'd go back out on the lakes and do it all again. This is the cost that Frederick Tudor's genius rested on. This is the human foundation of every cold drink served in Calcutta, every fever reduced in a Charleston hospital, every fresh fish sold at a Boston market in July. Men standing on frozen lakes in the dark, sawing and hauling and freezing, invisible to the people enjoying the product of their labor. Let me tell you about the logistics, because what the ice trade accomplished in moving physical material around the planet was genuinely remarkable. A block of ice cut from Wenham Lake in Massachusetts didn't just end up in a ship's hold by magic, it had to travel, and every mile was a race against thermodynamics. First, it was floated down the channel to the edge of the lake, men with pike poles guiding the blocks like a slow-motion cattle drive. Then it was hauled up a ramp by horses onto a platform where it was weighed and graded. Clear ice went to the export market. Cloudy ice stayed domestic. Ice with visible impurities went for industrial use or was discarded. From the grading platform, blocks were loaded onto sledges and dragged across the snow to the nearest ice house. These sledges were purpose-built. Heavy wooden frames with iron runners, each one carrying half a ton of ice. The horses that pulled them worked in teams, breath steaming in the cold, hooves wrapped in burlap against the ice. The ice house was typically right on the shore, a massive wooden structure with double walls stuffed with sawdust for insulation. These weren't small buildings. The ice houses on the Kennebec River in Maine covered acres. The ones along the Hudson were 3 and 4 stories tall. The Knickerbocker Ice Company's main facility at Rockland Lake could hold 200,000 tons. Inside the ice house, blocks were stacked tight, packed with more sawdust between layers, floor to ceiling until the structure was full. The sawdust was critical. It was the only insulation technology available, and it worked through simple physics. Air is a poor conductor of heat. Trap enough air in sawdust, and you slow heat transfer to almost nothing. Ice stored in a properly built ice house in January could still be there, still frozen in August. When a ship arrived, the process reversed. Blocks came out of storage, got loaded into wagons, hauled to the docks, and lowered into the ship's hold by crane and rope. The holds were lined with timber and more sawdust, packed tight to minimize air circulation. The ice was stacked with mathematical precision, each block fitted against the next to eliminate gaps where warm air could penetrate. A well-loaded ship could expect to lose 10 to 40% of its cargo to melting, depending on the voyage length and the weather. The Tuscany's voyage to India was at sea for 180 days, 4 months across 2 oceans. It crossed the equator twice, where temperatures in the hold could hit 90 degrees, and it arrived with more than half its cargo still frozen. That's not luck, that's engineering, that's decades of experimentation, figuring out the exact right ratio of sawdust to ice, the exact right way to pack a hold, the exact right ventilation to let heat escape without letting warm air in. Tudor and his captains learned by trial and error what worked and what didn't. They adjusted and improved with each voyage until transporting ice halfway around the world became not just possible but routine. By the 1850s, this infrastructure had grown to industrial scale. The Knickerbocker Ice Company alone harvested 3 million tons per year from the Hudson River. The ice houses along the Hudson stretched for miles, each one big enough to hold tens of thousands of tons. On special rail lines ran from the lakes to the docks. Ships designed specifically for ice with reinforced holds and improved insulation ran regular routes to ports around the world. The domestic market was even bigger than the export trade. Ice went everywhere in America. It went to cities in the South, where summer without ice was genuinely dangerous. It went to hospitals and hotels and private homes that could afford ice boxes. It went to the brewing industry, which couldn't make lager beer without cold fermentation. It went to the meat packing plants in Chicago, which used ice to keep beef fresh long enough to ship it east. The railroad and the ice trade grew up together, each making the other possible. Without railroads, ice couldn't travel fast enough to reach inland cities before it melted. Without ice, refrigerated rail cars couldn't exist, and the entire meat packing industry would have stayed local. The first refrigerated rail cars were literally just cars packed with ice, the meat sitting on shelves while blocks of ice melted underneath. Crude, but it worked. Cattle slaughtered in Kansas City could arrive in New York as fresh beef instead of living hungry animals that had lost weight on the journey. The same ice that cooled drinks in Calcutta also made it possible for a rancher in Texas to sell beef in New York. The same ice that preserved fish in Gloucester also preserved corpses in Charleston. Because before embalming became common, ice was the only way to keep a body presentable for a funeral. The ice trade touched everything. It was invisible infrastructure in the cold chain that we don't think about now because refrigeration made it seamless. At the peak, in the 1880s and 1890s, the ice trade employed tens of thousands of men directly in harvesting, and hundreds of thousands more in connected industries. Ice delivery, ice storage, ice manufacturing for the boxes that kept it cold in homes. The ice wagon became as common in American neighborhoods as the mail truck is today. Families bought ice cards, hung them in windows to show the iceman how much they needed. 25 pounds, 50 pounds, 100 pounds. The iceman would come by every day or every other day, hauling a dripping block up the back stairs with tongs, sliding it into the ice box in the kitchen, collecting his fee and moving to the next house. It was a job that required strength and reliability. And it was good enough work that families passed roots down from father to son, an entire infrastructure of cold, built entirely on blocks of frozen water cut from lakes and rivers by hand. And it was all about to end. The man who killed the ice trade was Carl von Linde, a German engineer who figured out something that had eluded scientists for decades: how to make cold artificially. The science was understood since the early 1800s. Compress a gas and it gets hot. Let it expand and it gets cold. If you could compress ammonia, remove the heat, then let it expand, you could create cold on demand. The problem was making it practical. Early machines were huge, unreliable, and dangerous. Ammonia leaks killed workers. Compressors broke down. The ice they produced cost more than the natural stuff. Von Linde's ammonia compression system, patented in 1876, changed everything. It was efficient enough to compete on price. It was reliable enough to run continuously, and it could make ice anywhere, anytime, regardless of weather or season. You didn't need winter, you didn't need lakes, you just needed a machine and a source of clean water. At first, the natural ice industry ignored it. Artificial ice was expensive. It tasted funny, people said, though mostly it tasted like the water it was made from, which was often cleaner than lake water. The harvested ice industry had a century of infrastructure, thousands of workers, established supply chains. How could a few machines compete with that? The answer came slowly, then all at once. The winter of 1888 to 89 was mild across New England. Not a disaster, just mild. Lakes that usually froze to 20 inches only made it to 12. The harvest was poor. Ice houses went unfilled. Prices spiked. And for the first time, artificial ice producers could compete on cost. They ran their machines harder. They expanded capacity. They sold to customers who had never considered artificial ice before because natural ice was suddenly scarce and expensive. Then came public health. Scientists had finally figured out that diseases spread through contaminated water, and lake water was by definition contaminated. The same lakes that produced America's ice also received America's sewage. Factory runoff, animal waste, human waste. The ice that kept your food cold might be carrying the bacteria that made you sick. Typhoid outbreaks were traced to ice supplies. Newspapers ran stories about what was actually in that frozen block sitting in your icebox. So health departments started inspecting ice sources and rejecting harvests from polluted waters. Suddenly, artificial ice, made from distilled water in controlled conditions, looked a lot more appealing. The natural ice industry tried to fight back. They marketed pure ice from clean mountain lakes. Wenham Lake ice commanded premium prices specifically because wealthy customers believed it was cleaner than Hudson River ice. They tried to regulate the artificial ice makers, lobbying for laws that would protect their industry. They fought against health inspections, arguing that their ice was perfectly safe. But the momentum had shifted. Every mild winter pushed more customers toward artificial ice. Every health scare convinced more people that machine-made was safer. Every year, the ice machines got cheaper and more efficient while the costs of natural harvesting stayed fixed. By 1900, artificial ice production had surpassed natural ice in America. By 1910, the writing was on the wall. By 1920, the natural ice trade was effectively dead. The great ice houses along the Hudson fell into ruin. The harvesting crews found other work or didn't. The ships that had carried winter to India were scrapped or converted to other cargo. A century of industry, a century of muscle and sawdust and frozen fingers, ended not with a bang, but with the quiet hum of compressors. The workers who had built this empire left almost no trace. Their names weren't recorded. Their stories weren't told. They existed in photographs, anonymous figures with long saws and ice hooks, faces blurred by time and exposure, standing on lakes that have since been paved over or polluted or warmed past freezing. But their work changed everything. Before the ice trade, food was local. You ate what grew near you, or you ate nothing. Meat meant slaughter day. A fish meant living on the coast. Fruit meant summer, and only the fruit that grew within a wagon ride of your home. The ice trade broke those boundaries. It let Chicago ship beef to Boston. It let Florida ship oranges to Maine. It let fishermen in Gloucester sell their catch in Ohio. It created the expectation, now so universal we don't even think about it, that food should be fresh regardless of season or distance. Every cold cut at your deli counter exists because Frederick Tudor saw money in frozen water. Every pint of ice cream in your freezer exists because anonymous men spent their winters sawing it free. Every vaccine shipped on dry ice to a clinic in the developing world connects back to a chain of cold that started on a frozen New England lake 200 years ago. The ice trade also created refrigeration, not the machines themselves, but the demand. By the time artificial ice arrived, Americans expected cold. They had ice boxes in their homes. They had cold drinks in their bars. They had fresh meat at their butchers. The ice trade built the market that refrigeration inherited. When refrigerators became affordable for home use in the 1930s, they didn't have to convince anyone that cold was worth paying for. That argument had been won a century earlier by men dragging blocks out of frozen lakes. The refrigerator just made it easier, more convenient, more reliable. But the desire for cold, the expectation of cold, that came from the ice trade. And it did something else, something harder to measure. It proved that the impossible was possible. Shipping ice to India was a joke until someone did it. Preserving winter until summer was fantasy until it wasn't. The ice trade was, in its strange way, one of the great engineering achievements of the 19th century. Not because the technology was advanced, a saw is a saw, but because the vision was audacious and the execution was relentless, and the scale was beyond anything anyone had imagined. We don't think about ice anymore. It's just there. You press a button on your freezer door and cubes tumble into your glass. You buy a bag at the gas station without considering where it came from. You don't think about the cold chain that keeps your food fresh from farm to store to table. Why would you? It works. It's invisible. It's nothing. But there was a time when ice was everything, when it was precious and rare and valuable enough that men would risk their lives to get it. When it was packed in sawdust and shipped halfway around the world because people were willing to pay anything for something cold. When it saved lives in hospital wards and revolutionized the food supply and made fortunes for the men who figured out how to move it. The men who cut that ice are gone now. The last commercial natural ice harvest in America happened in the 1950s, a novelty operation more than a real business. The skills those workers had, or the ability to read ice and judge its thickness and work a two-man saw for 12 hours in sub-zero temperatures, those skills died with them. Nobody needs them anymore. But I think about them sometimes. When I open my freezer, when I drop ice in a drink without thinking. I think about the men who stood on lakes before dawn, whose fingers froze and whose friends drowned and whose work made possible everything we take for granted about the cold. They didn't know they were building a revolution. They just knew they needed work and the ice needed cutting, and if they didn't do it, someone else would. That's how most revolutions happen. Not with visionaries and entrepreneurs, but with ordinary people doing hard jobs because someone has to. Frederick Tudor became rich and famous. His name is in history books. His grave is marked with a monument. The men who cut his ice are anonymous, their names lost, their graves unmarked, their contribution forgotten. But they were the ones standing on the ice. They were the ones shivering in the dark. They were the ones who actually harvested winter. And everything that came after, every cold drink and fresh steak and life saved from fever, everything rested on their frozen shoulders. That's the story of the ice trade. Not just a clever business, not just a quirky piece of history. A reminder that progress has a cost, and someone always pays it, and usually that someone is working in the cold while someone else counts the money. The next time you reach for ice, maybe take a second. Just a second. Remember that it used to be impossible. Remember that men died to make it possible. Remember that the cold you take for granted was once someone's entire life's work, given in frozen pieces, one block at a time. They earned that second. And now you know how America harvested 10 million tons of ice before refrigerators existed. If you want to see how another forgotten industry shaped the world we live in, that video is on screen now. And if you made it this far, hit subscribe. I cover the workers history forgot. I'll see you in the next one.